Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobby Holmes. I want to kick off this week with a few 5-star reviews from Apple Podcasts. Sir Fix-A-Lot said, I have been listening every week for a few months now, and I have to say I really enjoyed this podcast. Keep up the good work, Bobby. DBike420 said, good research, great voice, just someone telling you true stories. No crazy background noise, love it. And finally, from Moira Shing 09, Bobby is an excellent host. I love her storytelling and all of the details she provides. Every week, I can't wait until the next episode airs. Thanks to those who take a moment out of their day to leave me a review. It really does help boost the show and my confidence. This week's story suggestion was sent in via email from listener Jeffrey Johns. Jeff lives in Virginia and sent me more than one serial killer from his area to add to my list. Today, I'll be discussing Timothy Spencer, better known as the Southside Strangler. This story takes place in the mid-'80s and made history for being the first conviction using DNA evidence. Timothy Spencer was born March 17, 1962. His family lived in the Green Valley section of Arlington, Virginia. Tim was the oldest of 2 boys. His brother, Travis, was 9 years younger. Their dad took off when they were both very young, leaving Thelma Spencer a single mom. The boys' maternal grandmother did step in quite a bit to help Thelma out. She was a hard worker. She had to be. With her husband gone, she supported the family by working 12-hour days. Grandma helped when she could, but more often than not, the boys fended for themselves. Thelma was a loving parent, but the situation left her children feeling a bit neglected. It was obvious that Tim was a smart kid, but his grades in school did not reflect that, and his social behavior was even more concerning than his report card. He was caught multiple times during recess urinating and defecating outside. I can maybe see someone thinking they can run around the corner and pee real quick, but popping a squat to take a poop is really strange. If you're a returning listener, you have heard me discuss the McDonald triad in previous episodes. It's a set of 3 factors, the presence of any 2 of which are considered to be predictive of or associated with violent tendencies. These 3 factors are arson, cruelty to animals, and bedwetting. Tim definitely checked off the cruelty to animals factor. He once killed a parakeet that Thelma was bird-sitting for a friend. Another time, he tortured and killed a gerbil using push pins. The worst yet being the torture of a cat with a few of his friends in front of his younger brother, Travis. Travis was scared and confused when he saw them place a stray cat inside of a pillowcase and started throwing rocks at it. Travis asked Tim to stop, stating that he wanted to leave. But Tim ignored him, and Travis ended up walking home by himself. When Tim did return home, he bragged to Travis that he missed the best part. They set the pillowcase on fire. Check arson off the list. I don't see anything about bedwetting, but he's got 2 out of 3, and he did use the schoolyard as his personal toilet, so that's got to count for something, right? As an adolescent, Tim dabbled in robberies. He broke into homes and stole jewelry and other items that he could pawn for money. Thelma had a drawer where she stashed the money she'd saved up over the years. Money she was planning to use on her boys in their future, whether it be a car, braces, or possibly college. So far, she had saved up $1,500. One evening, Thelma, her boyfriend, and Travis went to pick up some food for dinner. When they returned, Thelma noticed that her money drawer had been cleaned out. She immediately went to Tim and asked him about it. He was the only other person who knew about the money and had a strong hunch he was the one responsible. He denied involvement and pointed to a broken window, stating that someone else must have forced their way inside and burglarized them. Thelma knew this was a lie. She gave Tim the evening to come forward with the truth, and the next day he was still denying everything. So Thelma called the police and reported that her son stole her savings. She must have been pretty confident he was responsible to do something like that. Tim was sent to a juvenile detention center for 8 months. When he got out, he didn't skip a beat. Tim went straight back to burglarizing homes. He was sent back to juvie more than once. Every time he came back home, he seemed even more hostile. Travis didn't even recognize his big brother anymore. Tim actually used Travis as a guinea pig for ambushing. He would hide in the house sometimes for hours and then jump out from the shadows to scare his little brother. At first, Travis laughed it off, but once Tim jumped out and grabbed him, he tied Travis's hands and feet using a pair of pantyhose, gagged him with a sock, and locked him in the closet. It took Travis 4 hours to wiggle his way out of his bindings. He was traumatized by the event. As Tim entered his 20s, he realized that stealing things to pawn wasn't giving him the same thrill that it used to. He began stalking women and fantasized about hurting them. To protect the identity of this victim, I will refer to her as Stacy. In the middle of the night, Tim spotted 23-year-old Stacy talking on a payphone in the parking lot of a grocery store. He watched as she hung up the phone and walked back towards her car. As she reached down to pull the handle of her driver's side door, Tim came up behind her with a knife and demanded that she get inside the car and drive. He sat with his face covered in the passenger seat and directed her to a cul-de-sac that was lined with trees. He pulled her out of the car and threw her on the ground in the woods. He removed all of Stacy's clothing and raped her twice. He told her to stay still while he got something else out of her car, but he took off on foot. Stacy got dressed and drove home. She called the police to report her attack, but the problem was she didn't see his face and had no way of identifying him. He struck again just 2 weeks later, this time breaking into a woman's apartment. He threatened her with a knife and dumped out her purse, grabbing anything of value. Then he proceeded to rape her. The same month, Tim attempted to abduct 2 other women like he did with Stacy. Even though he was armed with a knife, they were able to escape. None of these women saw the face of their attacker. His next successful abduction was in the surrounding city of Alexandria, Virginia. Like Stacy, he forced her into her car with a knife and had her drive to a secluded, wooded area. Even though his face was hidden, he covered the woman's eyes with duct tape. After raping her, he bound her hands and feet and placed her in the trunk of her car. Then he lit the back seat on fire and left her to die. The woman smelled smoke and frantically punched and kicked at the trunk. She must have had a guardian angel looking over her that day because the trunk swung open and she was able to escape the flames that were filling her car. These are just a few of the women who were victims of rape committed by Timothy Spencer. The attacks became more and more violent as time passed. In early 1984, Tim began stalking a 32-year-old woman who lived alone in Arlington. Carolyn Hamm was a successful lawyer working in Washington, D.C. He followed her long enough to learn her routine. After a Monday evening game at the squash club, Carolyn drove home and parked in her driveway. As she got out and walked to her front door, she was attacked. Tim dragged her down the hall and into the garage. He cut the cord from her blinds and used it to bind her hands and feet. After raping Carolyn, he untied her and then used the cord to wrap it around her neck, strangling her to death. After taking what he wanted from her home, he left through a window in the laundry room. For obvious reasons, Carolyn didn't show up to work on Tuesday, January 24th, 1984. Her secretary thought she was maybe busy running errands for her upcoming vacation to Peru that weekend. But when she didn't show up on Wednesday and missed multiple scheduled appointments, her secretary knew something was wrong. She called Carolyn's best friend Darla Henry and asked if she would drive by to check on her. Darla felt relief when she saw Carolyn's car parked in the driveway, but when approaching the front door, she noticed it was ajar. There was a layer of snow in the entryway. Darla looked around and instantly knew something was terribly wrong. One of Carolyn's neighbors happened to be outside, and she asked if he would assist her in exploring the home. The place had been ransacked. She walked up and down the halls, poking her head into the bedroom and bathroom, yelling for Carolyn. Then Darla found her. She was nude, lying face down on the floor of the garage. Darla immediately dialed 911 to call for help, but she was far too late. The autopsy report showed that she had been dead for 2 days. Semen was found on both vaginal and rectal swabs. Police took interest in the young man who assisted Darla with searching the house, and they asked him for a DNA sample. He went home and told his sister, Muriel Rancer, about it. She called the police to give her side of the story. Muriel said she was friends with Carolyn. Her brother had nothing to do with her death, and they should be looking at a man named David Vasquez. David was a former neighbor of Carolyn's and worked as the high school janitor. At age 38, he lived with his mother. He had an IQ of less than 70, which made him borderline mentally challenged. He did not have a driver's license, whether that was by choice or he wasn't physically or mentally able to drive. He tended to spend a lot of time walking around the neighborhood. Carolyn had mentioned to her friends that she found David creepy because she caught him watching her sunbathe. And Muriel threw in one final detail. She said she's pretty sure she saw David walking around outside of Carolyn's home the night she was murdered. Remember earlier how I stated that he lived with his mother and he didn't even have a driver's license? Well, that was still true. But 7 months before the murder, David and his mother moved 25 miles away to Manassas, Virginia, which made it highly unlikely David was the one walking outside of her window, unless his mother drove him there or he took multiple modes of public transportation. If she saw anyone at all, this could have been completely fabricated to get police off her brother's back. Regardless, David Vasquez was taken in for questioning. Guys, this is Making a Murderer 1984 edition. Police lied to David, telling him that they had lifted his fingerprints from the scene of the crime. They interrogated him for hours. Police fed him details about the murder that in turn David repeated back. Attorney Helen Fahey said, "The confession was not a good confession, in part because of who David Vasquez was, the type of person he was," unquote. What she is dancing around is the fact that David Vasquez was mentally challenged. And it wasn't a good confession because it wasn't a confession. He literally just repeated information. They asked what he used to strangle Carolyn. He says, "A big rope?" "No, David, it wasn't a rope." "Think, what did you use?" "A belt?" "Nope, not a belt." "Maybe a coat hanger?" David asked. All of these incorrect answers were given before Detective Shelton said, "Remember cutting the Venetian blind cord?" "Oh yeah, the thin rope," David said. What's ridiculous is that the investigators forgot to read him his Miranda rights before this interview, making it inadmissible in court. How does this happen so often? It's literally the first thing you do. David was brought back in for more questioning. This time, he told the investigators about a dream he had. Nowhere in this statement did David say this actually happened. "Girl was in my dream. It's a horrible dream, too horrible. I got myself in hell by breaking glass. The dryer was hooked up. Cut my hand in glass. I need help. Then I went upstairs. She kept coming out. She startled me. I startled her. We both kind of screamed a little bit. She told me what was I doing. I said I came over to see you. She wanted to make love. She said yes and no and then okay, and we went upstairs to her bedroom. Kissed a little, then we took each other's clothes off. She told me I would tie her hands. She said there's a knife in the kitchen, cut string off the blinds, just tie me. Then I asked her if it's too tight. She said no. Walked downstairs, took her pictures, she's nice. She said tie me some more. I brought some big rope, and she told me the other way. I says, what way is that? She says, by hanging. I says, no, don't have to hang. No, 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 no. She says, yes, called me a chicken, so I did it. I don't want my dream anymore. That dream, too much. Police took this statement about his dream as a confession to murder, even though he was force-fed all of these details the day prior. The truth is, he went home and all the trauma from being interrogated for hours about this horrific event gave him a nightmare. Now that David had, quote, confessed to the rape and murder of Carolyn Hamm, his lawyer thought the best course of action was to file an Alford plea. This is where the defendant does not admit guilt, but acknowledges the evidence is sufficient for a conviction, even though there was no evidence. In fact, the semen found on the scene was not a match for David Vasquez. But that did not stop the jury from finding him guilty for murder and sentenced to 35 years in prison. Insane. Shortly after Tim Spencer raped and killed Carolyn Hamm, he was caught burglarizing a home in Arlington. He was sent to prison for 3 years. He was released under the condition of him living in a halfway house. He used his freedom during the day to walk around the mall in Richmond, patrolling for victims. In September of 1987, he spotted a woman that caught his eye, 35-year-old Debbie Davis. He stalked her to learn her daily routine. She lived alone and just 3 miles from the halfway house, making her an easy target. One evening, Tim waited nearby as he saw Debbie park on the street. Leaving her car running, he forced her into the apartment with a knife. After tying her hands with shoestrings, Tim raped Debbie. Then his new signature, strangling his victims to death. But he didn't settle for a simple blind cord this time. I'm not sure how he even came up with this one. He placed a long sock around her neck and tied the ends to a vacuum cleaner hose attachment. He twisted the tube, causing the sock to slowly tighten with each turn. A neighbor noticed her car running in the street for a long period of time and called police out of concern. They entered Debbie's home to find her dead. Along with semen found on both vaginal and rectal swabs, investigators found pubic hairs that did not belong to Debbie and bagged them as evidence. Timothy Spencer thought he was being so careful, wearing a mask and gloves. The only traceable evidence he knew about was fingerprints. He would soon find out how forensic science was evolving. It didn't take long for Tim to attack again. Just 2 weeks after the death of Debbie Davis, he raped and murdered Dr. Susan Helms. She was a 32-year-old neurosurgeon resident at the Medical College of Virginia in Richmond. Susan lived with her husband, but they both had very busy schedules. The fact that Tim attacked while she was home alone shows that he was familiar with their routine. He entered the home through an unlocked second-story window. Susan's husband was the one to find her. She was in the bedroom closet with her hands and feet bound together. She had 2 belts around her neck. Cause of death was strangulation. As with all the other victims, Susan had been raped and semen was collected as evidence. Tim's youngest victim was 15-year-old Diane Cho. She was just a junior in high school and lived at home with her parents in the suburbs of Richmond. During the night, Tim broke into the Cho home and snuck into Diane's bedroom. He covered her mouth with duct tape to keep her quiet while he raped her. He strangled her to death while her family slept in the next room. Over the Thanksgiving holiday of 1987, Reggie Tucker traveled to Wales for a business trip, leaving his wife, 44-year-old Susan Tucker, home alone. The couple kept in touch, calling each other often, but the calls abruptly stopped and Reggie grew concerned. He called for a wellness check and Susan was found dead, lying naked on her bed. She had a blind cord tied around her neck and arms. Like the others, she had been raped and strangled. Detective Joe Horgus was called in to work on the Susan Tucker case. It seemed eerily similar to a case 3 years earlier in Arlington, the rape and murder of Carolyn Hamm. The ligature used to strangle both Carolyn and Susan was a Venetian blind cord. But how could this be when Carolyn's murderer is in prison? Yes, it could be a copycat killer, but looking at the scene, it was identical. Horgus went to visit David Vasquez in prison. David seemed very confused. He recanted his confession and told Horgus that he did not kill anyone. Horgus believed he was innocent and got to work finding Carolyn Hamm's real killer. He believed it was the same man who killed Susan Tucker. Soon, these murders were linked to the 3 women in Richmond. By now, the media had dubbed the man responsible the Southside Strangler. Horgus followed the trail of victims back even further than Carolyn Hamm. He believed the 9 reported victims of the masked rapist in Arlington and the Southside Strangler were one and the same. He went back and interviewed each rape victim and tried to piece together any new information. He noticed that there was a 3-year gap between the murder of Carolyn Hamm and Debbie Davis. And gaps like this typically meant the perpetrator was in prison during this time. Horgus started looking at criminals who were incarcerated from 1984 to 1987. He and his partner Mike Hill looked through hundreds of files. When he thought his head was going to explode, Horgus drove to the site where the masked rapist abducted his first victim. He parked his car and pondered for a while before a name finally came to him. Timmy Spencer, a young man he arrested in that same area for a burglary. Turns out, Tim was in prison from 1984 to 1987. And not only that, but his mother lived in Arlington, not far from where Carolyn Hamm and Susan Tucker were killed. Horgus said, quote, "It was like putting a puzzle together. We ran the check on him, and lo and behold, everything just falls into place." Timothy Spencer was placed under surveillance and arrested January 20th, 1988, under suspicion of burglary. Not a word was spoken about the murders. They had one chance to play their cards right with Tim. They needed one of 2 things, a confession or a blood sample. Tim used his right to remain silent during the interview, giving up very little information. Horgus was about ready to give up when he told Timothy that there was blood found on a window in a nearby home that was burglarized. He wanted a blood sample to rule him out as a suspect. Tim's like, yeah, sure, whatever. He obviously did not realize that his blood could be matched with the semen samples collected from the victims. The semen samples took 6 weeks to test, lightning speed compared to today. And Timothy Spencer was a match. DNA was so new that a hearing was held prior to Timothy Spencer's trial to determine if it was legally admissible in court. Circuit Court Judge Benjamin Kendrick said, "It was very controversial at the time. A lot of people said it was hocus pocus. I made the decision that it was reliable and was going to be admitted." It's funny to hear scientific proven facts talked about in this way, but I guess there are still many people who think science is hocus pocus. Just to convey the accuracy of this DNA test, was there a chance it was wrong? Yeah, but it's like 1 in 700 million chance. July 11th, 1988, Timothy Spencer first went on trial for the rape and murder of Susan Tucker. 5 days of trial and 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Tim guilty. He received the death penalty. He would wait on death row while he underwent trials for the other women. The next thing Joe Horgus wanted to do was set an innocent man free. The problem in the Carolyn Hamm case was that the semen sample had degraded over time and was not able to be tested. But Horgus laid out all of the evidence, all of the similarities, along with behavioral profiling by FBI Specialist Agent John Douglas. The governor agreed that there was a lack of evidence against David Vasquez. Given this new information about Timothy Spencer, Governor Gerald Bailey's pardoned David. After serving 4 years for a crime he did not commit, he was a free man. A family friend stated that David did not have hard feelings. When asked about the situation, he would just say, "It's okay, they just made a mistake." Timothy Spencer was tried and convicted for the murders of Debbie Davis, Susan Helms, and Diane Cho. He received a death sentence for each conviction. He was known to be responsible for Carolyn Hamm's murder, but was never convicted. At age 32, Tim was executed on April 27, 1994, by electrocution. He was the last person in Virginia to be executed using the electric chair before making the switch to lethal injection. As we all know, DNA is now a common and powerful tool used to convict criminals, but it's also helped to exonerate hundreds of innocent people over the past 40 years. And that is the Southside Strangler. I hope you all enjoyed today's episode. Thanks again to Jeffrey Johns for the suggestion. You can email your written or audio clip suggestions to KillerStoriesPodcast@gmail.com. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Killer Stories Podcast, and I'm on Twitter at Killer Stories PC. You can visit buymeacoffee.com/killerstories if you would like to support the show by giving me a one-time donation. The absolute best way to show your support is to share Killer Stories with your true crime-loving friends. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this has been a Killer Story.